Hey everyone, welcome back to the Strategy of Everything. My name is Dave Thomas. This episode is called The Strategy of Strategy, and that's because I sat down and spoke to world-renowned business author and strategist, creator of the business model Canvas, Alex Osterwalder. Alex, like I mentioned, created the business model Canvas. You probably learned about it in school. We talk a little bit about how that came to be, how he went from a student doing his PhD to creating a tool that's used by millions around the world. We talked about what goes into making a great tool and some of the challenges that business leaders are falling under today. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Alex Osterwalder. But thanks so much for joining me, Alex. It's, I don't undervalue the fact that you're a very, very busy guy. And so not everybody gets to sit down and chat. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join me.
My pleasure. Absolutely fun to do this with you.
Awesome. Yeah, I wanted to, and we'll get to the turbulent current situation. I think there's a lot of need for your work right now. It's funny because we just went through the pandemic, basically. There was this whole need for innovation, and now we're in a whole nother kind of world. So we'll get to that. But I do want to start because I don't know if everybody knows your full story. I don't even really know the full story. And so I'd like to go back. We'll get to college, we'll get to the PhD that led to the work, but what was young Alex Osterwalder like? You just entrepreneurial, selling stuff around, your town. What was it like as a kid for you?
Actually, not the selling part, but the making part. I always loved making stuff. I always loved visual things. So I've been just doing and creating all my life, and that's part of entrepreneurship. The other part is selling. Selling part came a bit later. That came at university, starting a little company and doing that kind of thing. And then I guess, the competitive aspect of doing sports is the other piece. I think as an entrepreneur, if you're not competitive, well, it's going to be hard, right? So because there are days where you really have to grind through. It's like going onto the court and training so that you're ready. Very similar in entrepreneurship and innovation.
So you created stuff as a kid that led you to university, and you started working on obviously what would become the business model Canvas. How do you go from I'm a student at school to I'm now collaborating with the teacher and creating something that, and I guess part two of the question is, at the time, did you have any idea what you were doing as far as the impact it could have? Or
so look,
were you just working on it?
I was always interested in, on the one hand, computers, and on the other hand, business. And not just, again, not the selling part per se, but how does business work? What are the components of a business? And I had the opportunity to work with Yves Pigneur, who was my PhD supervisor, became a good friend and co-author. We've been working together for over 20 years. And he has the same kind of mindset. First you try to understand why are things the way they are? And when you have that, you also know that they can be the way you want them to be. So everything is made. There's this famous speech by Steve Jobs. Everything around us is made by people who are no smarter than us. They just, went that extra step. And I did political science studies where you actually question things. Why is society the way it is? Why are institutions the way they are? And then you understand you can actually design businesses. You can design business models. You can design value propositions. So things are not just a given. We're not just powerless people. We're actors. And, with technology and now with AI, we're probably more powerful as individuals as we've ever been. We don't need a team of 100 people. There's now talk of, multi-billion-dollar companies with really small teams using AI. So I think it's an exciting time, also a scary time. But that kind of came from that, the curiosity of why things are the way they are, then knowing that you can create things if you want to. And that was always my passion, creating stuff and now creating companies,
And so when you were in that mode and started to dissect business models, because I think it was, like you said, most people were competing on price and things like that, right? Terrible old-timey advertising. But when you how did you come up with the idea, because all of your tools, all of your books, everything's about simplicity, making things as simple as possible. Simple is really hard, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so did you set out to make the canvas as a simple visual practical tool, or did you just come up with that became the solution for the problem that you were trying to solve?
Well, first, credit where credit is due. So we built, with Eve on the shoulders of giants. So there's a lot of stuff that was already out there, people thinking about business models, thinking about why companies are the way they are. I mean, the merit, I think, is looking at all of that, studying all of that, and then creating something and testing it with real people. So we kind of applied the design thinking and lean startup approach before it had a name. Actually, in science, it was called design thinking. It's a third kind of way of doing things where you create an object and you test and iterate it. So there's a scientific approach to that. And that's what we did. So we took everything out there and we tried to not just simplify it into one thing, but test it with real people to see could they actually describe their business model. Now, why did we do that? That was really Yves' idea. He wanted to create, he was from a management information system department, professor there. He had this idea, or this question, could we work like architects in business? Could we create computer-aided design in business? Not just for processes that already existed, but for business models, for more strategy. And if you want to do that, well, guess what you have to do first? You actually have to give the objects you want to work with some shape. So that's why we came up with something that was called the business model ontology. Ontologies are just describing a domain. It came from birds and animals and all that. Well, guess what? We created the business model ontology to describe business models. And that was actually fairly complicated. It wasn't super complicated or complex, but complicated. And then the canvas, the business model canvas emerged from that, saw that the business model canvas took off, and we deliberately tried to keep that one simple. And there's a story behind how that actually happened from model to business model canvas. But once we understood why that worked, we went on to create visual tools without the heavy kind of ontological kind of research behind that. Just, value proposition canvas, portfolio map, culture map. All of those were then purely simplicity, looking at what exists. Is there anything there that's good enough? Then we don't need to reinvent the wheel. If there's nothing there that's good enough as a tool, let's take the concepts that are there and turn them into tools. That was behind the culture map. Great thinking and concepts, but no simple tool. I think that's where Eve and I went the extra length, and that's what we do with Strategizer, is turn complex, complicated things into simple tools. The concepts are often there. Business thinkers don't always turn the concepts into tools. That's why they don't get adopted. So we're really in the business of creating user interfaces and user experiences for business tools.
So how did you take it? You said there's a story there. How did it go from the model to the tool? Always, yeah, how'd that happen?
It's a funny story. So there's this business model ontology, typical kind of thing with boxes and arrows, right? Like a consultant thing or an academic thing. And then at the time, together with Stefano Mastrogiacomo, we had a consulting firm and we were working with private banks. And they asked us to work on business models. So, well, good news, I had a concept there. So we took it, we put it onto a whiteboard, we drew it onto a whiteboard, and I said, oh, how can we use this in a workshop? So we simply just drew lines between the boxes so that we could put up sticky notes in the workshop. So the tool emerged. And then afterwards, when we wrote the book Business Model Generation, we needed a name. That's when we called it Canvas. Like a painter, you can paint something that exists, a landscape. So you can paint an existing business model, you just capture it. Or you can paint an imaginary landscape, business model canvas for an idea. But the canvas itself came from the concept. And that was already thought through in the way we laid out things. So it was just natural to draw lines in between and put up sticky notes. But once we understood that that visual aspect was powerful, not the concept per se alone, but the visual tool, and that was the whole design thinking movement kind of started then as well. Visual thinking movement started then. That's when we realized we could create other tools. And what we did actually some research, why did the business model canvas take off? And simplicity was a clear, thing that came out. So that's why we pushed simplicity even more. It's always been at the heart of our thinking, comes from design thinking. John Maeda wrote a book, The Rules of Simplicity. I've always been a big fan. Always also because I don't always understand complex stuff, then my brain melts down. I need simplicity, but it's an art. It's actually really hard to make simple concepts of complicated or concept kind of real world phenomena. Strategy, business culture, etc., are pretty complex or complicated, but we can simplify them so we can work on them.
It's hilarious and fascinating that the canvas, because the business model canvas is really the first of its kind as a tool, like you said, and the fact that there are literally hundreds of companies probably that make their living off teaching the business model canvas and taking it and being like, oh, I'm a coach and I do these things. But there's probably millions, thousands at least, of tools that have been created based off of the concept of that visual tool. So it's hilarious to me that you're like, well, we just drew lines on the board. Because when, having seen you work on some of the books, the later end of the books, the meticulous attention to detail that goes into all of it, to just hear like, oh, I drew lines on the board, was not the origin that I really expected. But go ahead.
The reason we could draw just lines around it is because we put an insane amount of work into understanding the concept. So the end part was just lines, but which 9 building blocks and how we would lay them out, that was, 3 years in my PhD dissertation for the first time we did it. That's why at the end part was super easy, because we did the whole complex part. So what I started to understand, which is also working with others and never getting to the same level as the collaboration with Eve, a lot of people just stop in the complex part. So they figure out, oh, these are the most important concepts, and then they'll put 20 boxes on a piece of paper and call it, whatever, canvas. And that's not going the extra length to actually figure out how can we minimize it to the minimal amount of boxes and then test and iterate. So we did that with a concept, but then we didn't know what visual tools were at the time, but afterwards was super simple. Then when we created the value proposition canvas, we did a lot of work first on what are the concepts there, and we wanted to build it on an existing concept, jobs to be done. So the original idea for the value proposition canvas was, I even talked to the people from Innosight, how can and the others who invented all of this, and asked, should we make a tool around jobs to be done? And they didn't really understand what I meant with tools, because again, it was a new movement. And we ended up with the value proposition canvas, which is a bit larger than the jobs to be done per se, and integrates the jobs to be done. But so there is a lot of groundwork so that you end up with only having to draw lines. So the way I'm saying it sounds like, that was easy, just draw lines, because we did a lot of the pre-work. And we even with Eve, we put out some assessment tools so that people can start to ask themselves, the tool that I just made, is it good or not? Because we've seen so many canvases, and to be honest, 95% are not really good because they didn't fully understand what goes into making a good tool. Right? They'll say, oh, these are 4 concepts, I'll put them on a piece of paper and I'll call it a canvas. That's how the end product looks like today, but they don't understand the whole process that led to that. So there are a couple of people who get there, and some actually asked us to help them make a tool. So the culture map is in the strategize toolbox. We didn't invent the concepts. That came from Dave Gray. But he came to us, he said, hey, Eve and Alex, can you help me make this into a tool? Here are the concepts. And we iterated around probably 10 different types of canvases until we got to the culture map, which is extremely simple. And when you look at it, you'll say, that's not possible. But the iterations that got us there, that was the path. So he had the concepts, we didn't have the tool. He came to us, so we iterated towards the tool. So there's an art in tool making that is underestimated, but it's possible. It's a design process. It's as simple as that. It's just like user interface, user experience, and there's a process to it. And we just try to do that again and again. Universal business challenges, that's what we like to solve.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, as somebody who's working on their own concepts and things, everybody's trying to figure out a tool to make things as simple as possible. I think for me, it's deeply ingrained from working with you and also working at Intuit and being, an innovation catalyst there, and their whole thing around, D for D. And it's all, they don't do the visual tool thing, but through my career, I've just been trying to pluck like a little bit of this. Oh, okay, I like a little bit of that. So aside from, okay, there's a lot of legwork that goes into it. How would you recommend people take, okay, I've got a concept, I've got an idea. People seem to like what I'm saying. What are the elements that are going to make a tool great versus, okay, you made a, something on Miro that we can look at and it's
Simplicity,
cool.
simplicity, and what I'm a big believer in is one tool for one job to be done. There are a lot of people who say, yeah, but the business model canvas doesn't map out the business model environment. Well, yeah, that's a choice because we didn't want to make a tool that does 5 things, kind of okay, but doesn't do one thing well. It's like nobody does heart surgery with a Swiss Army knife. Well, guess what? When we're talking business, if you put 5 different tasks into one tool, it's going to be too complicated and people are not going to use it. So I like the approach. Business model canvas does one thing, map out your business model. Value proposition canvas, other thing, map out your value proposition. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is don't try to make it ultra specific. So we never called it business model canvas to test your ideas for a startup or business model. Like you don't put process into a tool because guess what? Startup has a business model. Large company has a business model. Governments have a business model. They're all the same. There's like 9 building blocks, every single business model. However, if you're mapping out one that's existing, you'll use a different process than if you're testing an idea. So what we did is we just did one approach, map out your business model. Is it an idea? Well, guess what? Then merge it, like use the customer development process, lean startup process to test the underlying hypothesis. But you should never mix the process into the tool because otherwise you have a mess. So people try to put too many things into a tool. And again, one job, don't mix process and the thing you're trying to map out because they're not the same. And think about interfaces. You try to use the tools that already exist and then show how they work together. There's spaces where we didn't try to reinvent. So I think the value proposition canvas is great. But I also like the strategy canvas from Kim and Moborn, Blue Ocean Strategy, to compare value propositions. We didn't reinvent the wheel because there's something there. It's good enough. Like, why would we do that? So people tend to reinvent and not show how their tools work with others. And I understand, there's ego, people want to sell their consulting. So that doesn't really make sense because at the end of the day, people are going to vote with their feet. They're going to use what is easiest for them to use. And actually, some tools that we saw that took off and we said, those are really not good tools. Why are they taking off? We tried to kind of solve the underlying challenge. So we said, okay, not good tools, but they seem to get traction. Why? Okay, so we need to put something into the toolbox. That's how the value proposition canvas emerged. A lot of people are product centric. We never wanted to do product with a business model canvas. It's a different job to be done. So it said, okay, people need another tool and you work together. You navigate between business model and product, service / value proposition. Those are 2 different jobs to be done. You need both to have a successful business. One is big picture lens. How do you create value for your business? One is zoom in. How do you create value for customers? 2 completely different jobs to be done that you need to fulfill as an entrepreneur or as a business.
Yeah, and I love how they interconnect and play off of each other, but also the origin of the business model canvas too being an open source, put it out there. How have people taken it and used it in ways that you didn't? Maybe if you were even, like you said, if you were super prescriptive about exactly how to do it or made it too complicated, it wouldn't have been used like that. Because I think what's fascinating is you make something and you put it out there and you have an idea of this is what people are going to do with it. But how have you seen it over the years, people using your tools in completely, ways that you didn't expect?
Well, the first one is we kept it deliberately simple as business model is a business model. If you're a startup, large company, new idea, it doesn't matter. It's a business model, period. Now, what that did is that, business model is a concept that you need in many, many different places. So some people use it for strategy. Some people use it in mergers and acquisitions. Some use it to value their company, to have a valuation of the company. So there's so many places where you need to think about business models that's the fun part. If you make a tool that does one job well, people will use that in very many different places for some of these universal business challenges. So that was fun to see, anywhere from from mergers and acquisitions to strategy to the startup world, this is the tool that's used. Value proposition canvas, typically one thing that makes a lot of sense that I wouldn't have expected is that people use it in HR for their employee value proposition. That was fun to see. Wouldn't have expected that. Then if we take the business model canvas, we're really careful with changing the business model canvas because it works really well, but sometimes you have to. So Steve Blank, famous inventor of the whole lean startup movement with customer development, he was working with the US government, in particular with the Department of Defense, with Pete Newell, who was doing some work with the Department of Defense in the Army before. And they were using the business model canvas in the defense sector, typically for things related to the battlefield. And it didn't make sense to talk about revenue streams. It didn't make sense to talk about whatever else that didn't work back then. So Steve and Pete approached us. So together with Yves, we did some iterations and we created the mission model canvas, which is almost the same thing, but with some different names for the concept. So rather than talking revenue stream, we talk about impact. Rather than talking about customer segment, we talk about beneficiaries. So that needed adaptation. The value proposition canvas, on the other hand, didn't need adaptation. So there, again, you could call beneficiaries rather than customer segments, but that worked perfectly well. So that was a space where I would have never expected the business model canvas to be used in the US Department of Defense, and then in the State Department. And then, of course, what we saw, that made more sense to me because I came from that world as well. It's not for profit because they have a business model as well. But then with the mission model canvas, that was a good adaptation because I rarely see really good adaptations of the business model canvas. I see other great tools, but the business model canvas has been adapted in ways that I don't think really work, which adoption also shows, right? But so the Department of Defense was the fun thing to kind of see. And me as a former pacifist, it was also, interesting. Today I have a slightly different view of the world given where we are. But that was fun to see that it had, really big impact on really, really important problems in the world, not just business. Business is great, creates jobs, but at the end of the day, peace in the world, refugee crisis, and all of that is probably more important challenges to solve than creating another AI startup.
Yeah, 100%. We're going to get to the current state of the world and some of the things and ways that you can use your tools and books. I got one last question and we'll move on to that. What does it feel like to know that you created something that is taught in business, like universities around the world, that you made something that like kids are studying? And like I meet people all the time and sometimes they see my resume, oh, strategize, you work strategize. Oh yeah, I learned that in school.
Yeah.
Like, what does that feel like outside of like, okay, I'm an inventor, I'm a author, I'm thing, but like as a person, like, what does that feel like?
Like that's what we were striving for. We wanted to have an impact. When we first decided to write the book with Yves, we were in a cafeteria of the University of Lausanne, said like, what would be success? What would be success like? And we wrote it on a napkin, wrote, yeah, if we sell 50,000 books, that would be success. And now we're in the millions of books, but even more importantly is millions of people using the tools. So how does that feel like? It's like, I didn't change. I think it's cool. It's nice, but I just, see this as, okay, that's awesome. What did we learn? Can we create more tools to create more impact, or can we get people to adopt these tools in a better way? Now, not saying it's not fun to hear people's, I work a lot with senior executives, and sometimes they don't know the tools, actually quite often, because they're already way past university. And they say, oh, my son, actually, can I take a selfie with you? Because my son is being taught these tools at university across the globe, right? From Mexico to Asia, Thailand, Brazil, US, the best business schools, everything. It's taught everywhere. And
That's
that's
crazy.
cool. But does it change me? No. The only thing I would ask is like, how is it taught? My niece, when she was studying in St. Gallen, she sent me some pictures of how it was taught. And, I think there's some improvements there. So I will only think, okay, how can we do a better job and help more students get better education? Because the tool alone is not enough. It's how it's taught, it's how it's used. So I just get I get more interested in how we could do a better job when I hear the adoption. It's like, okay, how could we make everybody as good as we are with everything we learned at Strategizer?
Yeah, no, it's incredible. So, yeah, let's get to some of there's kind of two topics I think that are timely and relevant. One that's had the probably the greatest impact and will have continue to have the greatest impact on businesses, how they run, how they operate, and that's the adoption of AI. You must be dealing with 1,000 different companies. Everybody you talk to is probably like, Alex, what do we do? So, Alex, what do we do?
And so, surprisingly, AI is of course a topic, but the senior leaders I talk to, they're not, like in alarm mode on AI. And today, there are actually bigger challenges than AI, that companies have to immediately deal with is the disruption of supply chains and, deglobalization, all of that. So that's on the table of CEOs. Today, I just talked with one of the biggest cosmetics companies in the world, and AI is not their challenge immediately. Now, it's a huge opportunity, and I love playing with it. So I just created a couple of days ago or a week ago my digital twin. So I can now speak Arabic in various dialects. I can speak any language you want, thanks to a tool that is available for like 30 or $70 per month. And in the future, I'm going to send my avatar to Zoom meetings, right? Maybe to podcasts. So you get the privilege of maybe being the last one I'm, humanly
Maybe I
talking.
am. Maybe this
So
is
yeah, so
this
so
could
that's
be
the
robot
reality.
Alex.
That's the reality, that there are huge opportunities out there. And I would really, technology is not the problem or just the opportunity. It's actually governance of your company. So is the same thing as with any technology. If you do not have an entrepreneurial CEO who doesn't just execute a known business model, who doesn't want to explore, and doesn't put in place with the senior leadership the governance to do this, it's not going to happen. And obviously, a lot of the large companies today, they're very obsessed with managing what they have, what they know how to do. So it's going to take them some time to adopt AI. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, even if, startups are actually growing to multi-million dollar businesses in very short amount of time. The growth rates are crazy. So you might see more disruption for a while, and then the big companies will get more concerned. But right now, the adoption is actually still very slow. If you take the bigger picture, it's mainly used for efficiency gains. Like just think of how many phone, when you're calling a company, how many times do you still have press one, press two? Like it shouldn't be that way anymore because today there's much better ways, right? You could have, I don't know, you could have George Clooney answering you on the Nespresso hotline, but they're not doing that yet, right? So it's very slow. It's very slow. So my advice is, after all this blah blah, first thing, fix your governance to embrace experimentation with AI so that you can start to scale it. There's no recipe of how to do what exactly other than experiment. Just try it. And these things are changing so fast. All you can do is experiment. Experimentation mindset is the number one thing that will help you figure this out.
And it's also the most difficult thing to implement into a company that doesn't have that mentality. And I think, we can talk about AI, like that's fine, but if you don't have that experiment mindset, the testing culture, how they're never going to get there. This is just the next thing that they're going to miss out on. So how, and then you've written books about all of these things. So
Yeah.
how do they, like you need to become that if you want to survive. The invincible
Yeah.
company is all about how to
Yeah.
innovate
Yeah.
through a big company. Where do you start if you're that executive who's like, we're not ready to even test this, so what do we do?
There are two, I'll keep it very simple. There are two main places to start. Is that, first of all, you do need an entrepreneurial CEO who has the mindset we need to experiment. And the only thing you need to do is give a very clear process of how teams who have an idea can start experimenting. And then you need some very clear guidelines. How does a project get funding or get killed? Because there are too many projects that get very big, get a lot of funding, and they shouldn't survive. So the first thing I like to really kind of teach, in quotes, senior leaders is make a distinction between exploration and exploitation. When you're running a business, you make big bets because you know the environment and the world. Analysis is most important. When you're exploring, forget analysis, just get people to start with small budgets. So if you teach them that mindset, what exploration means, and that it's different from exploitation, and by small experiments you manage risk, They get it. These are smart people who run, mostly the people I get to meet, they're pretty smart. They don't get to the positions they are if they're not smart. Once they understand that, they will invest in experimentation. So that's the first one. The second aspect is actually then the scaling. So there are two breakpoints. Is companies are risk averse, so they don't start experimenting. Fix that first. Once you're experimenting and you know what works, there's another breakpoint. It's actually scaling the projects. So it's not enough to have something that works and that you've proven that works, because they'll get killed by the antibodies of the business that works different. So that's the second aspect that the leadership needs to really fix, is create the governance system so that ideas that have been proven can grow and get investments and can scale within the existing business. So those are the two things to fix. Get people started on experiments. Super cheap, super easy, not risky if you do it the right way. And the second one is, once you have those proven ideas, actually make sure that they scale. And that's a little bit more complex. You need the right governance structures with the business leaders of the divisions that you have, but it's not rocket science. And that's what we really like to do in companies. And once you have leaders who understand that, is actually relatively straightforward. The challenge, of course, is that, not a lot of leaders stay in their position for long. It's not like Jamie Dimon, who's been, there for 2 decades. A lot of senior leaders are in their jobs for 2-3 years, so they don't really care about the long term. This is long-term stuff. Now, with AI, it's actually not as long term anymore. You can do things within months or a year, and things change very quickly. So it might be an opportunity to go faster and get career results within 1 or 2 years.
One of the challenges, I think, internal, people who are more entrepreneurial want to try testing at their company, bringing it to their bosses, things like that. One of the challenges I think that they hit is we can't run these quick little tests because we're afraid of ruining the brand or doing something that doesn't look 100% perfect. How do you navigate that if you're trying to move quickly, you're trying to do these small tests, but then you have this governance over top of you that just isn't set up for it?
So there's an assumption there already by many, people in companies, is that there is a risk of experimenting. Well, if you do it right, the customers often like that. So I won't mention the name, but there's this big drinks company that we worked with, and they put, water in a bottle in a box and put it into the shelves. And people took the box and went to the checkout. And then, the people would say, sorry, that was an experiment. Here's, a discount for whatever you want to buy from this brand. Well, guess what? 2 things. People always love getting, goodies for free, and they love being part of an experiment, of something that's being created. So if you manage it well, there is no risk. So there's an assumption there that is going to damage the brand. I actually think it's the contrary. You can co-create with customers. In B2B, even easier, you co-create with customers. So I think that is a misunderstanding of how things work. And we're not talking about a pilot. When you launch a pilot, you should have already tested a lot of things, right? So there's a misconception of what an experiment actually is. So that's the biggest thing. And then, look, if you're still crazy afraid, you do it under another brand. And then that's even better sometimes, because if you can succeed without, your big brand name, then there's even more evidence that it's going to work. These are very, very manageable challenges. What you really want to do is get the leaders on board, right? So you do need lawyers when you experiment in pharma. You do need to understand the regulatory context when you experiment in finance. But these are all things that are very, very manageable. There's some complete myths around this. So unfortunately, that still exists. But this is a profession that we know how to do things.
Yeah. So you mentioned AI isn't the top of the list of things people are dealing with today. When you're talking to CEOs lately, I can imagine what the number one topic of conversation is, with the economy going through what it's going through. What are those conversations like? What are people asking? What are the problems that are really top of mind right now?
Yeah, so growth and resilience is top of mind. Growth per se, we are in an economy, or in the system where you need to grow. In particular, as a CEO, when you want to keep your job, in most cases, you need to show some growth. Still, sometimes CEOs are able to earn a lot of money without showing the growth. Still a myth to me how that happens. But so a lot of people I speak to, they need to create that growth. They need to manage their companies. That's number one. The resilience has become a big one now because if the US and China decouple, well, guess what? That is a really, really difficult topic to deal with for any company that has any supply chain. Again, I was talking with somebody in the cosmetics industry. When a very, very large part of the chemicals industry is linked to China, well, guess what? The global supply chain is going to have to change. And talking about textile, the same thing. So some of these supply chains are really hard to untangle. So that right now is the number one topic. And then it's just, how do you run a global company with 10,000 or 100,000 or more people? That's just hard. So we kind of underestimate, like I never had to run a company with more than 100,000 people. Just keeping that company aligned, just running it is actually a hard job. So sometimes I do understand that they don't really care that much about innovation because just running a business is actually hard. And it doesn't have to be large, just running. I'm running a small company. That's already hard and given the economy today. So the top themes are sometimes you'd almost say basic, but it is hard to run a company. And then of course AI comes onto that, but I don't think it still comes back to governance. It still comes back to explore, exploit. So AI changes everything, and at the same time it doesn't, because without the governance, technology doesn't matter. Technology is just technology. This one happens to be more impactful and have a bigger impact longer term, so might create more urgency. But yeah, it's fascinating actually to be in this position that I can work with some of these top leaders and top companies. It's fascinating to follow. And the last thing I do is judge them because they have really, really hard jobs, right? So when they don't want to innovate, I always ask, why not? Like, what is it? Is it understanding? Is it willingness? Is it the constraints of the board? Never judge, never judge. You never see what's going on. It's very easy it's like armchair sports, armchair business comments are even easier.
Yeah, and then when we look at these things, it happened during the pandemic as well. We saw a lot of people go, everything's changing, we got to do this, but we're not ready for it. And then business kind of gets back to usual. And then now again, there's another crisis and people aren't ready for it. So, how important is it for them or for businesses in general, to start being more forward thinking, putting these principles in place when it's not a crisis? Because it's like when there is a crisis, it's kind of too late. Like you can't just all of a
Yeah,
sudden snap your fingers and become
yeah,
a super innovative
yeah,
company. You have to
yeah.
have that machine in place first. So how do you look at that?
I do think COVID has rattled companies and make them more prepared for even today, the situation. So there is more resilience in companies. There is a bit more agility because they went through it in COVID. So that is actually the good side. Beside this global pandemic, it did rattle. It was a huge disruption for most companies. So it did prepare them a bit. So I do think there's a little bit of a different mindset. On the other hand, it's just the leadership. The board of directors need to hire the right CEO and understand that today's challenge is less about managing the existing, it's creating the organization that can prepare itself for the future while running the business. So I'd actually push board members a lot more to understand how things work, what type of CEOs they need to hire. So sometimes I blame the CEOs less than the boards because they hire the wrong type of leaders. And I've seen that, time and again. Not everybody, hires a Satya Nadella. That was a brilliant move. And so those are the types of people you want to hire who can make the best out of the assets that are there. So I think it starts number one. I'm not for people cult, but at the end of the day, the right leader can gather the right team. It makes a phenomenal difference. So it's like when you take Steve Jobs, I wouldn't just put the focus on Steve Jobs. I would put the focus on the people he hired the second time around, because the first time around, what people forget is that he got fired. So we always kind of talk about Steve Jobs as if he was a god. It took him a lot of learning until, the second iteration of Steve Jobs and Apple. And that was a team effort. So yes, genius, but also the ability to work a lot more with a stronger team. So boards, hire the right CEOs who understand, explore, exploit, and can put together the right teams to create the future. And there are many of those. I had the opportunity to meet, Alan Mulally, who turned around Ford, Hubert Joly, who turned around Best Buy. Those leaders exist. We have this stereotype of the CEO of a large company or companies in general. And unfortunately, that stereotype is kind of reemerging as the success factor. I think the servant leaders are the ones that you want to hire, and there are quite a few of those. And it's encouraging to see some of those getting to the very top of great companies.
One of the concepts that I have been talking about and working on is the clarity of the North Star mission of the company, the communication of that down to the very, very hands-on keyboards level, and making that clear and simple, because I find there's a couple different reasons why that doesn't happen, and it causes all kinds of chaos. So I was thinking about that while you were talking about
Yep.
the right leader.
Yep.
How do leaders make their strategy clear and simple for everybody to understand? Because it could be brilliant, but if we don't understand why I matter in this, it's
Yeah.
not going to work.
100%. And there, I'd really quote Hubert Joly, who turned around Best Buy. He wrote a book called The Heart of Business. And he really gave people a mission. So he's a turnaround manager, ex-McKinsey, but actually doesn't correspond to the cliche that we have of a turnaround manager. So he didn't come in and just fire a lot of people. He actually gave people a reason, a mission to be at Best Buy. And I have some friends who said, "Oh, that's cynical with these low-paid workers." But I think it's actually the other way around, is you need to give people a mission to be part of something together, because at the end of the day, you show up to work. If you just show up to earn another dollar, like that's not going to work for the company nor the employee. So the more you can get people excited, and sometimes we're a bit cynical about these things, of course we need to treat workers well, but can't, there's a certain limit to what you can do in terms of salaries, depending on the job. But we can give people a really good and interesting mission to work on. And then you attract the right people. Not everybody should be, there where they are today. I think companies, or even people who join a company and just are there to earn some money, that's unfortunately the reality of people. We're lucky, you and me and others that we work with are lucky to be able to choose the jobs they want to choose often. But I think that's the job of leadership, is to give people a good reason to get up in the morning. Because without that, like, wow, what is life worth living when you spend 8 hours, or if you're in a leadership position, 12, 14 hours a day doing something you don't want to do? That's really sad. So I do think that's the leader's number one mission, is to give that North Star and to make it crystal clear so that people can get excited. And again, it's an experimentation. If your message doesn't resonate, well, then change it, right? So I think that's a fascinating topic. And I've been cynical in the past about, the big why. But if you can formulate that the right way, and really learned that from Hubert Joly, that he could do that with Best Buy, was very, very fascinating. Easier to kind of follow when you're a tech company like Apple, but that you can do that anywhere, that was really fascinating to learn from Hubert.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think some of the things you were talking about is the constraints that you might be under. So again, we rely on this, for him, I rely on this workforce that sees this as a punch in, punch out job. How important is it for leaders and leaders of businesses to understand the different types of constraints that they're going to be under, and then which ones to focus their time trying to work around, and maybe which ones to avoid?
I think that's where these business tools come back in, right? And that's what we're excited about Strategizer, is if you can visualize the topics, the constraints, to make them tangible without making them too complex or complicated, that's when you can really do good work. And I do think, the whole topic of co-creation is, not everybody needs to decide on things, but make everybody part of the journey, integrate them into the thinking so at least they're heard, and then make clear, why you're making certain decisions is important. And I had to learn that as a leader as well. And, I'm still on the learning journey, but I really strongly believe in transparency and helping everybody understand the why. Because as a CEO, you really understand the constraints, and running a business, paying salaries, etc., is not easy. And not everybody understands all of the variables. They don't have access to that. So the more you make things transparent, the more you actually help people understand. So I think sometimes it can be that some leaders say, they don't understand. Well, did you try to make it accessible what the constraints are? Did you try to bring people on board for the journey? So I'm super excited about those companies that have maximum, transparency, who have maximum decentralization to give people also the ability to make the decisions where they're better off than central management. So I do think working with those constraints, but also making them transparent to everybody so that they can follow the why is super, super important. That's modern management. Modern management is not giving a North Star and then just tell everybody to march. That's over, What we really want today is a North Star, the constraints, things that are changing, and getting everybody on board so you can work into the right direction. I think alignment is, for me, the biggest topic that in a dynamic world that you need to focus on. Alignment, transparency, buy-in, those are the important topics of the future.
Yeah, and I think they've always been important topics. I think high impact tools for teams is like a team alignment map is something that I use all the time. And I think, when you look at the constraints and aligning the team, I think another big part of it, and it's baked into a lot of your tools as well, which is de-risking, identifying risks that need to be de-risked, that you actually have the capability of managing, and then identifying opportunity and knowing which one I should actually go for. There's a never-ending amount of those things. So how do you look at identifying the risks and opportunities that are going to have the biggest impact on someone's company?
So I think, innovation, exploration, and strategy are top down and bottom up, and we need to understand the difference. So I do think the best ideas in an organization, they come from anywhere, and not always, maybe you could even say rarely, from the very top in terms of very concrete ideas. The vision, the kind of direction needs to come from the top. Where do we want to go? Bigger picture, and then allow everybody to participate in this. But so what you need to do top down is create that clear alignment so everybody knows what's in, what's out. There are moments where you don't want to go for crazy transformative initiatives because we just need to turn around the company. Well, guess what? You give a very clear direction. Here's what's in. We need to do these kind of efficiency innovations. This is the kind of thing we want to think of. Again, back to Hubert Joly, we had him on our podcast where he was talking about the 2 years where they did the turnaround at a Best Buy, and it was very focused on, like, innovation was not a topic. We just need to kind of get onto the same boat in the same direction. And then after 2 years, the vision got much broader. So you need to give that top-down kind of direction and the guardrails and the governance system so that people can explore. And then bottom up, people who want to explore will explore. You have innovators in every company. Ideas, there's no lack of ideas. There's no lack of people who want to explore ideas. I do think what we sometimes overestimate is our ability to pick the right ideas and the right people. You can't. It's just like venture capital, we can't pick ideas. That's why VC firms come up with portfolios. They diversify risk. So in innovation and exploration, we need to do the same thing, give a lot of people the opportunity to start things, but then very quickly, if there's no evidence, we kill the projects. That's what you call governance. So there's this top-down direction building and governance, and there's the bottom-up exploration. Some companies like Haier in China are very extreme. They have micro-enterprises, like thousands of micro-enterprises, super decentralized. That's the extreme end. I think that's where we kind of think the direction could go. Is if everybody's aligned on the direction, well, maximize the decentralization of decision making. And then probably the more realistic models are somewhere in between.
The last concept that I've been talking about and working on a lot is about your unfair advantage, and knowing and being explicit about, I have an advantage in this situation because of XYZ. Maybe it's an experience, maybe it's a natural talent. I had an unfair advantage. I closed business one time because I worked at Strategizer, and I was talking to, they're an education firm, and they started talking about, business. I was like, oh, I worked with those guys and blah, blah. And they were like, oh my God, so that was an unfair advantage for me, but I knew explicitly about it. And I think a lot of the time we play to our strengths or do those things. And you can think about that concept individually or as a team. And so how do you think people need to, how can they apply that to a business to say, hey, like we are suited to do this because of X,
Yeah.
and therefore, gives us a
Yeah.
competitive edge?
The first thing I'd say is, well, of course, that's very helpful and powerful, but people sometimes are too narrow in thinking of how they could apply those strengths or unfair advantages. I'll give you a silly example, but it's very powerful. Um, Amazon, when they started Amazon Web Services, the reason they could disrupt companies like IBM was a very interesting one. Nobody kind of thinks of the origins of all of that, is because they had an extremely effective, cost-effective infrastructure, not like IBM, not like Google, not like Microsoft. So because they were in e-commerce and retail with laser thin margins, they had a very cost-effective IT. So while that was, you don't think of that as a strength to go into completely different business, which is selling your infrastructure to another company. That's the way how you should think about your unfair advantages. Where can you apply it somewhere else? The other unfair advantage that they had compared to IBM is they knew how to get people to pay with a credit card. Salespeople at IBM, they go and play golf with, they don't know. It's a completely different ballgame. So that's why Amazon Web Services took over the world really quickly at the beginning, because they had an unfair advantage that nobody had in that field of IT infrastructure. So we're often too narrow in applying those advantages. And I think that's where Amazon has been very good, is they always thought of broader, applications of different business models with synergies in the back end. And today businesses, they often think about new products for new segments in their field, rather than asking, what are our unfair advantages? If you're, telecom firm and Skype disrupts you and you can't sell phone calls anymore, well, guess what? You still have millions of customers. What do? You sell them TV. And so access to, there are many assets. So innovation can come from everywhere. People are way too narrow in thinking product innovation for new niche segments. That's not going to get you very far. Really deeply think about your assets, your strengths as an individual or as a company, and then start innovating from there. So people are too narrow in using their strengths for other things than what they already know how to do really well.
Yeah, that's perfect and great, sentiment to kind of wrap up on. I'm going to be conscious of your time. Time is money, and I know that you're extremely busy, and it's the end of the day in Switzerland. So thanks again for doing this. Is there, are there workshops coming up? Are there boot camps coming up that you guys are pushing tickets for?
Yeah. Cool that you're asking, because, well, first of all, thank you for having me. We're launching a program library of applying our tools for very broad arena of topics, like formulating or articulating value propositions in B2B sales. Simple things like, how do you gain faster customer insights? So we're launching this library in a week or two. Just check out strategizer.com. So thanks for asking. We're super
Yeah, no,
excited.
that's awesome. Yeah, that's super exciting. I think there was always, as a marketer by trade, there's a million applications, practical applications, especially the value proposition design, value proposition canvas is the go-to whenever I'm doing a persona, which leads to key messaging, which leads to ads and all those kinds of things. So can't write. There's 1,000 practical. If you need some practical ideas of how to use them for marketers, let me know. But yeah, thanks again, Alex. So great to talk to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it. That was our interview with Alex Osterwalder. Again, I just want to thank Alex for taking the time. He's a very, very busy guy, very high demand. So to take an hour to chat with me about these things was unbelievable, and really appreciate it. So check out strategizer.com. Check out their new library of practical applications of their tools. And if you don't mind, hit us a like on Spotify or on YouTube, subscribe, leave a comment, and connect with us on LinkedIn as well. I'm at They Call Me DT. This has been The Strategy of Everything.